You are a freedman grammar teacher in Rome, sometime in the 1st century AD. You buy a wrecked, overgrown vineyard 10 miles outside the city, at a place called Nomentum. It has sat neglected for years. You have never run a farm in your life. You pay 600,000 sesterces for it anyway. 8 years later, you sell a single season's grapes for 400,000 sesterces. The grapes are still hanging on the vine. Nobody has picked them yet. That is 2/3 of your purchase price, recovered from one harvest, before a single grape touches a press. The historian Columella writes this up a generation later as proof that a vineyard is the best investment a Roman can make. Here is the part Columella leaves out. The man's name was Remmius Palaemon. Pliny the Elder, who tells the story first, says Palaemon did not buy the farm to make money. He bought it because he wanted to be seen owning one. By the end of this video, you will understand why Rome's own agricultural writers could never agree on whether vineyards actually paid off, and you will understand the one bill that came due for any owner who bought a vineyard for the wrong reason. A bill you can find in a Roman's own handwriting, not in a later historian's guess. Before a single number, the ground rule. Roman prices come in 2 coins. The sestertius is the everyday unit. 4 of them make 1 denarius, the coin Rome actually paid its workers in. This script converts everything to denarii, then to one thing that means the same amount in any century, a day's wage for an unskilled farm laborer. That figure comes from one surviving document, Diocletian's Edict on Maximum Prices, issued in 301 AD, which fixed a farmhand's pay at 25 denarii a day, food included. That edict is 3.5 centuries after the vineyard you just heard about. Every conversion in this script drags a number across that gap. You should hear the gap every time a number lands. This is a reconstruction, not a lost ledger. No complete annual account survives for a single Roman vineyard, anywhere, ever, in one document. Nobody's full-year record of money in, money out, and money left over has come down to us. What follows is built from 4 different centuries and at least 5 writers who never read each other's figures. This is a puzzle assembled after the fact, not a filing cabinet somebody opened. Start with the one piece we do have in full, what it took to build a vineyard, according to the man who wrote Rome's oldest surviving farm manual. Around 160 BC, the senator and former consul Cato the Elder published a straight inventory for a vineyard covering 100 eugera, a Roman land unit equal to just under 62 acres. It takes 16 people to run it, an overseer, a housekeeper, 10 field hands, an ox driver, a donkey driver, a willow bed worker, and a swineherd, 2 oxen, 2 donkeys plus a third for the mill, 3 complete wine presses, and storage built to hold 5 entire vintages at once, so one bad selling year never forces you to dump wine at a loss. Cato does not give you a total price tag. He gives you a shopping list and lets you do the arithmetic yourself. Modern historians who have studied that list, Richard Duncan Jones among them, think that is not an accident. Cato ranked the vineyard the single most profitable use of Roman land, ahead of an irrigated garden, ahead of an olive grove, ahead of a wheat field, which he placed dead last. A list built to make that ranking look self-evident does not need to show its work. Cato's ranking held for a long time. A century later, Pliny the Elder still calls it correct, provided an owner cuts what he calls superfluous expense. But a Roman senator buying a vineyard was rarely just buying acres and a press. He was buying a name people would say out loud at dinner. The historian Nicholas Purcell argues that elite vineyard ownership in Italy ran on a second currency entirely, status, and the gift economy built around fine wine, a named vintage from your own estate, handed to the right guest at the right dinner, did work that a bank balance never could. Rome priced that second currency in the open. Pliny the Elder records that a bottle of the legendary Opimian vintage, pressed in 121 BC, was still being sold roughly 160 years later, under Caligula, for 960 sesterces. Convert that, 240 denarii, very nearly 10 days of a farmhand's wage, for 1 jar of wine already too old to drink. Pliny says by that age it had turned thick as honey, useful only for flavoring something younger. An ordinary jar of everyday wine in the same period ran about 20 sesterces. You were paying roughly 48 times the going rate for prestige, not for liquid. That is the real product a vineyard like Palaemon's was selling. Not wine, a name attached to wine. Which brings the numbers back to Palaemon. in full. You put down 600,000 sesterces. That converts to 150,000 denarii, or 6,000 days of a farmhand's labor. 16.5 years of one man's wages, spent in a single afternoon at a notary's table. You will not see a return for 8 years, while the vineyard is replanted and managed under a bailiff named Sthenelus. Then one season's crop, unpicked, sells standing on the vine for 400,000 sesterces. That is 100,000 denarii, 4,000 labor days, just under 11 years of a working man's life, recovered from a single harvest. Columella cites this as the strongest argument in Rome for vines over grain. He is not wrong about the arithmetic. He stays silent on the man. Palaemon was a celebrity grammar teacher with a well-documented taste for luxury. Roman sources close to his own lifetime say he bought things purely to be envied for them. He does not run a ledger. He hires a bailiff and replants a ruin, because a ruin owned by a famous name would embarrass him, then gets lucky, or skilled, or both. Nobody who wrote it down thought the distinction mattered enough to record. What they recorded was the number, because the number was the point. Here is what a purely commercial owner never has to pay, and a status owner always does. Pliny the Younger writes his own letters, in his own name, about his own vineyard, a century or so after Palaemon. In one, he describes a season where the grapes came in thin. He had already sold that year's crop in advance to buyers who paid up front. That is the normal Roman arrangement. The harvest disappointed. Pliny had no legal duty to refund anyone. The sale was done. The risk was theirs by contract. He handed money back anyway, 1/8 of the price, to every buyer, more for the ones who had bought the most or paid the fastest. He tells us why, in his own words. Not generosity, he says, but fairness, equitas, because it would have shamed him to let people who trusted him eat the whole loss alone while he kept their money. That is not a business decision you would find in any ledger. That is a rich man protecting his name at his own expense. In a letter he clearly expected other rich men to read. This is the real danger waiting for you in this economy. Not that a bad harvest costs you money. Every farmer everywhere accepts that risk. The danger is that once the vineyard is doing the work of your reputation, a bad harvest costs you twice. Once in the field, and once again voluntarily at your own writing desk, because the alternative is becoming the man in Rome who let his buyers eat the loss alone. The industry around Palaemon and Pliny was already failing on ordinary commercial terms, which made that reputation bill harder to justify every decade you owned the vineyard. Columella himself, writing in the reign of Nero, admits directly that Roman confidence in vineyard profits had slipped since Cato's day. He blames cheaper wine flooding in from Gaul and Hispania, provinces that Italy's own exporters had spent 2 centuries building into wine-producing rivals, plus a slave labor supply that had grown more expensive to maintain. The Cestius family estate at Cosa alone had shipped an estimated 400,000 amphorae a year of Italian wine into southern Gaul in the century before Columella wrote. That trade armed Gaul's own vineyards to compete against the wine that built them. By 92 AD, the pressure turned official. The Emperor Domitian, per Suetonius, issued an edict banning new vine planting in Italy and ordering at least half of all provincial vineyards uprooted, after a bumper wine harvest coincided with a grain shortage. It was a direct attempt to legislate the industry back into shape by force. Suetonius does not record it working. Modern historians of the edict broadly agree it went largely unenforced, and it was formally struck from the books under the Emperor Probus nearly 2 centuries later. You cannot regulate a market back into profitability when part of what you are selling was never a commodity in the first place. No source hands you a typical year, and that gap is not an accident of history. What survives is the spectacular win and the admitted loss, because those were the only years worth writing a letter about. An ordinary break-even season was not a story anyone bothered to record. So here is the honest range. Strong year Palaemons, the only fully documented triumph in the record. A single harvest returning just under 11 years of a laborer's wages, against a purchase price of 16.5 years, inside 8 years of ownership. Treat this as the ceiling, not the average. Nobody claims it happened twice, to him or to anyone else. Ordinary year, undocumented, and that absence is itself the finding. Columella insists a well-run vineyard beat a grain field in most years. He never says by how much. His critics, the unnamed contemporaries he wrote an entire chapter to argue against, clearly thought his numbers were the exception, not the rule. Take his conclusion. Do not take a number he never actually gave you. Bad year, Pliny the Younger's. A documented shortfall met with a voluntary refund of 1/8 of the sale price to every buyer. A cost with no ceiling, because you would be paying it in reputation as much as coin, and reputation does not come with a price floor. A vineyard was never just a crop, it was a name you handed to a dinner guest, and the wage anchor tells us exactly what that name cost the moment the harvest turned. You bought the label, you pay for the land,